Imagine, like, a historical superhero who levitates rival wizards and literally dashes their brains on rocks. Sounds crazy, right?
Absolutely wild.
Well, what if I told you the real man behind that myth was actually a kidnapped teenager hiding a really dark secret? Welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah, it is quite a contrast. Today we're looking at a fascinating stack of sources you all sent our way. We've got forensic facial reconstruction papers, ancient hagiographies of St. Patrick, and some really modern archaeological dig notes.
Right, it's such a great mix of material.
It really is. Our mission today is basically to explore how modern science and historical scrutiny help us, peel back centuries of myth to reveal the actual beautifully flawed humans behind these towering legends.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we think about reconstructing a face from a skull, it's not just blind guessing, right?
No, definitely not.
I mean, it's like restoring a vintage house where you have the structural beams, but you have to completely guess the paint color and the exterior trim. How do researchers actually make that leap from bare bone to a recognizable face?
What's fascinating here is the mechanism behind it, specifically this thing called the Manchester method. Forensic artists don't just eyeball it.
Right.
They place physical tissue depth pegs at very specific anatomical points on a skull to represent average muscle and fat thickness.
Oh, wow. So it's a literal grid.
Exactly.
Mm.
And using this mapped grid, bone-anchored features, like the nose and the eyes, hit about 67% accuracy. That's under 2 millimeters of error.
That is incredibly precise.
It is, but the paint and trim, meaning the lips, the ears, and the age-related wrinkles,
Yeah.
well, those heavily rely on artistic interpretation because bone alone doesn't dictate cartilage or surface skin.
Which makes total sense.
Yeah.
And we see this exact blend of peg-by-peg science and artistic interpretation with the 3D reconstruction of St. Anthony of Padua.
Oh, yes, that's a perfect example.
Based on a 1981 examination of his skull, alongside his famously incorrupt tongue, which meaning the church claims it miraculously never decayed, which is just a wild detail.
Total bizarre, yeah.
But that reconstruction gave us a surprisingly regular guy. Just a broad-faced, swarthy man with a stubbly beard.
Right, and just as forensics strips away that artistic license to find physical truth, historical scrutiny strips away magical folklore to find the real person underneath.
Wait, I'm struggling with that transition a bit.
How so?
Well, it's easy to scrape clay off a skull to find the bone underneath. But how do you scrape myth off a 1,500-year-old text? Like, how do we know what the actual historical bone structure of St. Patrick is when all we have are magical stories?
To find that, we have to look past tests like the 7th century hagiographies by Mircea.
Okay.
These were basically ancient, highly exaggerated biographies meant to make saints look like literal superheroes. Mircea depicted Patrick battling wizards, levitating that rival druid, and surviving a trial by fire in a house built half of green wood and half of dry wood.
Which raises an important question, right? Like, what is actually left when we strip the magic away?
And the reality check is pretty jarring. The real Patrick wasn't even Irish, he was Romano-Welsh. And he absolutely did not banish the snakes. The Ice Age took care of that by keeping them off the island entirely.
Okay, but what about the shamrock?
Well, he probably didn't need a shamrock to explain the Trinity either. The Irish pagans he was preaching to already worshipped triple deities like Danu and the Morrigan.
But here's where it gets really interesting. His actual unembellished life was far more dramatic than the myths.
It was much grittier. Just think about the modern bioarchaeology happening at the St. Patrick's Chapel excavation in Wales.
Right, they found over 200 bodies there.
Exactly. And researchers aren't relying on grave goods, fancy buried swords or jewelry to tell the story. They use stable isotopes.
Which are like chemical signatures in the teeth.
Yes, they act like a geographical GPS, telling us exactly what kind of water they drank and where they grew up. Combined with ancient DNA, they were revealing the brutal reality of early medieval life.
Like severe malnutrition and grueling labor.
Yeah, incredibly harsh conditions.
And Patrick's own writings, specifically his confession, perfectly mirror that raw reality. He was a kidnapped shepherd who survived enslavement to become the world's first unequivocal abolitionist.
But he was deeply flawed too. In the text, he hints at a dark, unnamed sin he committed at age 15.
Which historians theorize could have been murder.
Right. And if true, it perfectly provides a psychological foundation for his later fierce pacifism. It might even explain his intense personal boundaries.
Like his absolute refusal to partake in a pagan peace ritual with sailors that literally involved nipple sucking?
Yes, exactly that.
I remember reading that in the sources and thinking, wow, history is just bizarre, but he held his ground because it violated his strict morals.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it shows we really don't need magic for a compelling story.
Yeah.
A flawed, intensely real human being grappling with a violent past is fascinating enough.
So what does this all mean? Why should you, listening right now, care about the difference between a real skull and a legendary face, or a Welsh teenager and a wizard battler?
Because understanding this gap between bone-hard facts and legendary embellishments trains you to think critically about the information you consume today. We are constantly fed modern hagiographies.
Oh, like highly curated, exaggerated myths about politicians, tech founders, and celebrities.
Exactly.
You have to look for the structural foundation before you buy into the paint job, which leaves you with this to mull over. If bioarchaeologists dug up your bones 1,000 years from now and combined them with a few wildly exaggerated rumors about your life, what kind of bizarre mythical hero would you become?